Welcome back, everyone. I'm here again with Preston Dennett, a UFO researcher. He's done a ton of interviews with folks and has vetted hundreds of, if not thousands of reports for commonalities and things like that. We covered that in the last episode. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about, it's going to be a little bit more speculative in the sense that what's driving these experiences? What are they? Is it kind of a phenomena in nature we don't understand yet? Is it entities from another dimension? Is it entities from another world, etc.? So with that, Preston, I'm gonna try to make this a little bit more. Some of these questions start a little bit more analytical and then kind of work our way down to the speculative. So as you're doing these reports, you mentioned in our last episode, grays. How many different kind of forms? I don't want to use the word species because that assumes that it's, extraterrestrial as opposed to transdimensional or even transformational. And by transformational, like, who knows? It could be what we've evolved to from the future or something. So with that, like, how many different forms have you seen of these entities? Starting with, grays is one, obviously. What else have you seen in some of these reports that you've gathered?
Well, before I jump into there, let me just briefly say, finding out UFOs were real, ironically, made me much more skeptical. I really had to reevaluate everything. This was very difficult for me, coming from a scientific point of view, trying to wrap my head around this. I'm like, aliens, really? So this was not something I just jumped into. I'm like, this is aliens by any means.
Right.
But the fact is, this is what people are reporting. And I would say,
to be clear, like the New York Times has reported on the USS Nimitz. Viewers can check that out. Like, this is not, there are things in our skies that we don't know what the origin are. They behave, and they fly kind of violating basic aeronautical concepts like drag. They can turn on a dime. It's almost like, I think the best explanation people could use to describe it is it's some sort of anti-gravity propulsion. But again, who knows?
Unconventional
sorry,
movement.
I didn't mean to interrupt, Preston. I just want to be very clear. Like, we're not. This is something that like hundreds of, if not thousands of credible people have described.
Oh, hundreds of thousands, millions.
Yeah.
I mean, the database is there are far more reports than people realize. UFOs are real. There's no question of it. What they are, that's another story. But absolutely, the reports are in the millions. People are seeing something. And when it comes to these more extensive cases, because a simple sighting of an anomalous light is by far the most common thing people will report. Mm-hmm. But next to that would be daylight sightings of a metallic object of some kind, with unconventional movement. It looks strange, it moves strange, it sounds strange. It's clearly not any of the quick go-tos, which are, Venus or a satellite or ball lightning or a plane, a helicopter, balloon, and so forth. But then we have this landings where these things actually will land on the ground. And then we have cases of people seeing entities. And then we have cases of people being taken on board. And so there's all these reports. And when it comes to entity sightings, I would say about 50 to 70% of the ones that I've got in my own database, and this is absolutely reflected in people who've studied this, are grays, or some variation of what we would call grays. And by that, I mean anywhere from 3 to 5 foot tall figures with large bald heads and dark wraparound eyes and very pale skin, often wearing jumpsuits or something that's so skin tight they might not even appear to have clothes on. I suspect they do, communicating telepathically. And that is the most common type of report. But I will say there's quite a bit of variation in what people would say are grays in terms of what they're wearing, you know, the shapes of their eyes, their facial features, the size of their heads, their height, very much the variation we see among humans on our own planet. So, but beyond that, I would say the second most common entity sighting is human looking, very much like us, though perhaps usually described as being 6 to 6.5 feet tall, and often very good looking, sort of genetically perfect. All different races, not just Nordic, as it's often termed, which is simply not true. There are dark skins, all races, from Asian to Mesoamerican to Middle Eastern to, you know, Nordic. But that would be the second most common, and often described when people see multiple figures of these kinds as looking very similar, to the point of almost twins or brothers and sisters. So that is just a detail that turns up quite a bit. And the third most common category, and this is just so strange to me, but you're sort of stuck with the evidence. This is what people are reporting, which is praying mantis type figures. Mantids is what they're often termed. And these look very much like the praying mantis insect, except they're generally described. I cringe when I talk about this to skeptics, because I know how this must sound.
Yeah, they're going to say it sounds crazy. But look, you're this is just what people are telling you, and that's also kind of an odd thing for people to all randomly, without talking to each other, corroborate, right?
Yeah, let me tell you, when skeptics encounter this stuff, they go out of their minds. It's very difficult for them. This is one of the reasons I do this work, this research, is because for me, finding out UFOs were real was very upsetting. It was not good news. I was scandalized. I was pretty upset. This should have been taught in schools. And we haven't even gotten into the government and their research into this, but it's clear to me they know what's going on from the beginning. But at any rate,
Well,
yeah, praying mantis.
Yeah. Let's get back to that, because I definitely want to cover that. I mean, it could almost be its own episode, but let's like continue through the classification of what you've.
Yeah. So mantids are quite common. So I'm going to say grays 50, 60%, human looking 10 to 20, mantids 10 to 15%. Always humanoid figures. It's quite distressing to me. It was very much Star Trek. And
yeah, well, that's the other thing that a skeptic will say. Like, given the biological diversity on Earth, why do they always happen to be humanoid forms as opposed to other intelligent forms of life?
Yeah. Well, this caused me to absolutely refuse to examine the evidence for years, because I'm like, no, aliens would have tentacles. Aliens would be the blob. Aliens would be something so different we couldn't understand.
Yeah, or energy, or right, pure energy, right.
The chances of parallel evolution like this would be absolutely remote. But this was pure supposition, not based on any actual facts, because we don't have the information to be able to make these kinds of conclusions. And these are the reports, and that's what it comes down to. And there's another category which I would just call strange humanoids. There's a good 5% involving short, little, blue-skinned, flat-faced dwarfs. My other sister-in-law saw these as a young girl, and I had her draw them. She's an artist. And whenever someone describes these to me, I'm like, can you draw them for me? Most people can't. And then I will show them the picture that my sister-in-law drew, and they go out of their minds. And they see it, they're like, oh my God, that's exactly what I saw. I've worked very closely with my sister-in-law, Christine is her name, and would bring her along on investigations, because she can draw things very much like a police sketch artist. And she would sit down with the experiencer and draw their stuff. And you could see tears come to their eyes when they see this image come to life. And then we pull out the other pictures and they're identical. And that shakes these people because they realize, wow, this isn't something that people prefer to be termed crazy. They would prefer any other explanation than to have to face this reality often. And for them to get this kind of corroboration is difficult for them. So there's another category I would just call strange humanoids of all types. And I get absolutely unique descriptions. And it's not unusual for people to contact me and say, I saw this or that. Have you ever had a case like this? And I have to tell them no. But there are tall whites, as they're often described, which are 8 feet tall, very much human looking, except very pale skin and very large eyes and bluish green usually, and whitish hair. That's fairly common. But strange humanoids of all types, and even robotic figures. So ultimately what it comes down to is they're humanoid almost without exception.
Do you think that's how they choose to present themselves to us, or is that their actual form?
Actual form. And I'm not going to say it's true in every case, because there are reports of what we would call screen memories, where a person will have an encounter with, some figures walking into the room. And this is particularly prevalent among children, who will describe seeing clowns or superheroes or Barbie dolls or owls, or, I've heard it all, cowboys, 3 foot tall teddy bears with large dark eyes. And then we'll go on through adulthood and continue to have encounters, and they end up being grays. And sometimes they will appear as perfectly human and then drop that. They're sort of putting forth, I'm not sure if it's hypnosis or whatever they're doing, but they're able to put on an appearance that is very much like these various figures. But the fact is, there are so many cases of people who describe grays in the same detail that it becomes clear that grays is probably their true appearance, mantids, and so forth. And just
what about the reptilian sort of forms?
Yeah, I don't get a whole lot of those cases for whatever reason. I think they got a lot of attention because they are so, dramatic, and I got a handful. 10 or 20 compared to the hundreds of the others. But absolutely, reptilian is another form or type or species, and is often described as massive, 6, 7, 8 feet tall, usually twice the width of a human. So we're talking, 300-500 pounds, extremely muscular. Yeah, I hear myself talking about this stuff, and I always like, oh gosh. I encourage people who are skeptical to do your homework. If you are skeptical, the chances are you have not looked into the subject and actually examined the eyewitness testimony, because there is a lot of it. And yeah, it's very difficult to read something and say, this is true. Well, ask your friends, your family, your coworkers, people you trust. You're going to get a huge shock, because I'm dollars to donuts, someone has had an experience like this.
Yeah, you'd be surprised if, I would say in the last 2 weeks, someone who was following my show, who I knew from, I don't want to get into too much detail, but he called me because he was enjoying the show, and he told me about, an experience, not kind of a one-on-one type thing, but like seeing lights in the sky, doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And he didn't tell anybody, because he was, and to this day I kind of mentioned to him that I knew you, and I'd be happy to make an introduction, but he still thinks someone would think he was crazy.
Yeah, both my sister-in-laws who saw entities did not tell me that right away. They waited for a year or two, and finally
but usually someone will just if you communicate that you're open to hearing the experience, right? It's not, and that's why I'm very careful about my questions, right? I'm not calling them aliens. I'm not calling them species. I'm calling them, different forms. Because I don't know what these things are. I've never had any of these sorts of experiences, but I'm intrigued by them,
Yeah,
and
that's
I'm
an
open.
interview technique I learned. Do not ask someone if they saw a UFO. Ask them if they've had an unexplained experience. Don't ask them
Right.
if they saw aliens. Just tell me what happened to you.
Well,
Uh,
even the government, right? Because of the stigma, they call them UAPs now, right? Unidentified aerial phenomena.
yeah, which is
And
ridiculous. I'm not at all happy with it. It's no better. It's just semantic wordplay. This field is suffering badly from ter terminology. A UFO could be anything, honestly, but it's become synonymous with the alien craft.
well, let's actually talk about that. And like as I mentioned, alluded to at the very beginning of this episode, um, we're going to go into the speculative a little bit, because a lot of the work you do doesn't always settle it. It's because you're just describing the output of these experiences, but there's not often answers as to the why. So to the extent that you can, because you may have more data to suggest one possibility or another, and I'm just curious about that. So what do you think these things are? Are they transdimensional? Are they the, an advanced form of humanity, visiting from the future? Are they extraterrestrial? Are they, and then we can go to the kind of extreme supernatural, like demons and angels and this and that. Like, what, based on the data that you've gathered to this point, where does your gut tell you these things are?
Yeah, I can tell you I've certainly looked into it, and I have a lot, a room full of books on demons, on angels, on all aspects of supernatural entities of all kinds, multiple personalities, psychology.
Yeah, that's the other thing. That's the other possibility that I didn't just, like, it could be some natural phenomena that we're just not familiar with. It could be some like new force, like nuclear, like strong
yeah,
nuclear, weak nuclear, gravitational. What's the last one? Electricity and magnetism. It could be another force that we just don't know yet, that manifests itself in certain ways, and it's just how our sensory organs react to it. It could be, it could be some psychological thing, right?
yeah, it's
We
not.
don't know. Yeah, yeah.
It's absolutely not psychological. We know this because psychology does not leave implants in your body or burn the ground or doesn't photograph. Uh, there are numerous theories to explain all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Certainly the most popular among researchers and experiencers alike is extraterrestrial in the classic sense. People like us from other planets.
But people like Jack Voulet are not so sure, right?
Yeah, and he's put forth the second most popular theory, which I do not subscribe to. I'm not. There's a lot of stuff put under the UFO umbrella, and all of it probably isn't aliens or extraterrestrials. But his theory is that this is an intelligence which wears different masks and sort of adapts to a person's belief system and is very symbolic. And I don't like this theory because it's very vague. It's got no mechanism behind it that we can really understand.
It feels kind of creepy.
It's very anthropocentric too. It puts us at
Yeah.
the center of the universe, which has, from a scientific viewpoint, has not worked out with other theories. We're not the center of the universe. The world does not revolve around humanity, because this theory is basically saying the ETs are an aspect of us, or they're so interested in us that it's all about us. It's very anthropocentric and very vague. But it does have some merit to it for sure, because some of these cases just are beyond bizarre and do contain clear symbolic elements to it and just don't seem to quite fit the extraterrestrial theory. But that's definitely one of them. Interdimensional is another. These are beings like jinn, like angels and demons, who are deceiving us. Time travelers from the future. This is another theory. Some say perhaps they're not extraterrestrials, they're crypto-terrestrials.
And they've been here forever. And
yeah, they've been on our planet. They're not coming from outer space. So there's all these theories floating around. And what I've, in my own mind, what I've done is like, let's just take a look at the evidence in its totality. And what is the evidence? We have eyewitness testimony, and a lot of it. It is the best evidence out there, this simple eyewitness testimony. And this can be many, many people to a single sighting, like the Phoenix Lights, which actually is a misnomer. It wasn't lights, it was a craft of some kind. And according to the thousands of reports, this thing was about a half-mile wide, maybe a quarter mile to a mile, a large V-shaped craft, metallic. This was a solid object that thousands of people saw. So these are eyewitness testimonies, and they are not often, but enough, backed up by affidavits and lie detector tests and so forth, and trained observers. So we have pilots, we have many astronomers, by the way, have seen UFOs, a lot of them. So beyond eyewitness testimony, we have photographic evidence, a lot of that, with radar returns. That's another good form of evidence that's often overlooked. We have landing trace cases, some 3,000 really good, solid cases. Well, quite a bit more than that, but these landing trace cases are very compelling evidence, like the Transon-Provence case in France, where an object landed on a railroad, and they could tell just from the indentations in the railroad ties that this thing weighed some thousands of pounds. And a case in Rendlesham Forest in England, or Socorro, New Mexico, or Delphos, Kansas, where it cooks the ground and glassifies the sand. And so there is landing trace evidence, right? Then we have medical evidence, and a lot of it, and this is termed in most organizations as injuries only, which is not true. It's healings as well. And I was a real pioneer in that particular aspect of it. That was my first book. And I've documented some 300 cases, which are verified by doctors with before and after x-rays and medical records. So we have many, many physiological effects. We have animal effect cases. We have electromagnetic effect cases. There's a substance called angel hair. And this is a spiderweb cotton candy-like substance, which has been seen on over 100 occasions, which is not a lot when you consider the totality of sightings,
right?
But certainly enough to look into, of the substance that's emitted from these craft, which is apparently, as far as we can tell, some interaction with the hot plasma fields surrounding these objects, which interacting with the atmosphere in some way produces this cotton candy spiderweb-like substance, which can fall in great quantities and has been collected. It often sublimes into the atmosphere, that dematerializes quite quickly. But there are some 20 or 30 cases where people have been able to collect this and into containers, freeze it or what have you, and get it into a scientific lab. And each case, it's the same materials that are coming forth, the same magnesium and boron, I think, was the element that I latched onto, because it shouldn't be falling on the ground. Well, it's not like super rare. It shouldn't be just lying there on the ground. And it's also a substance that we use in our own technology for shielding nuclear reactors or nuclear materials rather. So that, I don't know, I just found that intriguing, but it's very intriguing. I forget all the elements that are in it. I'd have to look it up, but
Any thorium?
I believe probably, yeah. I believe there is.
Because they use thorium in fast breeder nuclear reactors.
Yeah, again, I'd have to look it up, but it's very consistent with samples from Australia, from Italy, from the US, all over the world. This has happened. So that's another great form of physical hard evidence. And another piece of evidence I would point to would be implants. Now, these are what doctors term foreign bodies found in people's bodies that they can relate directly to a UFO encounter, generally an onboard experience, generally a procedure. And these have been removed by numerous researchers, primarily Dr. Roger Lear, who has since passed away, but I met him. I've interviewed some of his patients, wrote about them. Some were good, good colleagues of mine. And this was really remarkable evidence. I mean, this was smoking gun evidence. These had materials in it which should not be in a person's body. And by that, I mean,
it wouldn't be naturally produced, or they wouldn't consume it somewhere and
right.
Get lodged down.
Right. And it had a composition very similar to meteoritic iron. And some actually gave off, electromagnetic signature. And there was no foreign body reaction. And they could relate this directly to, an incident. And often there'd be no entry wound. Sometimes there would be like a scoop mark or something. But the point is, this is hard physical evidence. So you look at all this evidence and you're like, okay, what's going on here? And people say time travelers from the future. That's very anecdotal based on a handful of reports. And I've scoured the literature for this, and there are a few cases. I mean, you can march out any case to fit your theory. That's not science. Science is taking the evidence and then forming your hypothesis and trying to verify it, not vice versa, not cherry picking and shoe fitting to prove what you believe. And the time travelers from the future hypothesis is not supported by the totality of the evidence. It just isn't. And neither is this Jacques Vallée, John Keel, Jerome Clark theory of an intelligence that wears different masks, because there's no way to prove that. And that's pure speculation based on your own belief system. And I don't see how you can support this. And I understand why people are putting this forth, because there's high strangeness to a lot of these cases. But if you look at the fact that there's landing traces and there's implant removals and there's people who been reported taken on board and they are missing from their bedrooms, from their yards, from their homes. There are police searching for little kids who are not where they're supposed to be. And so this is not psychological, is what I'm saying. This is not someone like thinking they've been taken on board. No, they're coming back bleeding or with eye irritation. I interviewed one gentleman who rushed to the doctor after one of these experiences twice as a kid. He had arc burns on his eyes. He was basically blinded for a couple of weeks because his eyes swelled up so bad. And they said, "What, you were staring at arcs, welding arcs?" It's like, "No, I wasn't. I woke up like this." So we have really good evidence that this is a physical phenomena. And what it comes down to is people are seeing humanoid figures. We are seeing what appears to be craft with windows and darting around in the sky. They look metallic. And when they land, they leave little metallic fragments. And it's magnesium. It's very pure metals. There are a number of metal fragment cases which speak towards these being metallic craft. These craft are hovering over our mines, our metal mines, gold mines, titanium mines. There's a case in Karnes City, Texas, where they hovered over a uranium mine and took the materials, drained it, it was no longer fissionable. So there's some really good evidence that this is exactly what it appears to be. And for me, what it comes down to is the crash retrieval reports. And by that, I mean, these are reports coming from whistleblowers within the military industrial complex, people who are taken to supposed events like Roswell, the Roswell UFO crash, or Aztec crash, or Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, 1965. There's a good 100 or 200 of these cases. It's far more common than people realize. And these are reports where we've allegedly retrieved these objects and the bodies. And this rests solely on eyewitness testimony at this point. But this is evidence that we allegedly have within military bases, according to these testimonies. And there's a lot of them. There are hundreds upon hundreds of what we would call whistleblowers. And I've interviewed them myself. And if this is true, and I think it is, just based on these testimonies, we have this craft, we have these bodies, all bets are off. As near as I can tell, our government knows what this is and has known since the 1940s, for 80 years. They know precisely what this is. And these recent reports from the Pentagon, there was a 6-page report, 7-page report released on some 144 sightings where they said, we don't know what this is. We have no evidence it's technological, but it could be Russian, it could be Chinese technology.
There's no way. There's no way.
It could be us, they said. I'm like, wait a second. This is the Pentagon saying it could be you and you don't know. They were talking in circles and they used the word extraterrestrial. They did, which was a 180-degree turnaround. But they, as near as I can tell, they know exactly what this is and have known for a very long time that this is extraterrestrial. That's my assessment, that we are dealing with extraterrestrials in the classic sense, beings like us from other planets. And I get pushback on this, and it's annoying. Like, how do you know that that alien figure is an alien figure? I'm like, well, you've seen a bird in the sky. How do you know that's a bird?
Yeah.
And when you're climbing a tree, we call this a tree. How do you know that's a tree?
All right. So you come down on the extraterrestrial origin side. So I definitely want to talk about the U.S. government piece, but I think there's enough for another episode on that one. But so the last part of this particular episode, what do you think if they are extraterrestrial and they've been visiting us for a very long period of time? Two questions. The first is, what is their intent? And then the second question is, have you seen any cases? My understanding is the overwhelming majority of cases appears to have been kind of positive intent. Have you ever seen any instances of malicious intent? So those are the two questions.
Yeah, well, I think they're very much related. What is their agenda? What is their intent? Why are they here? Well, one thing we do know is they've been around a very, very long time. And while it's really become popularized since the modern age of UFOs, 1947, coinciding pretty much exactly with the atomic age, when Kenneth Arnold, a pilot, sighted some objects over Mount Rainier. And from that point on, it escalated in a very dramatic way, which is historically unprecedented. We haven't had these huge amounts of sightings really throughout history. But we have evidence, from petroglyphs to Renaissance paintings to Middle Age wood carvings to hieroglyphs in Egyptian culture to Vimyanas of ancient India. So this is a phenomenon that's been around a long time. And as near as we can tell, there's multiple agendas. And I think we have a pretty good handle on this, based on all the people who've really looked into people who are being, say, taken on board. And I think this is very much consistent no matter what researcher you look at. There's a very strong medical theme that runs through these onboard encounters. People are physically examined. That is the most common thing that people report.
Mhm.
So it's clear that there's something along the lines of an interest in studying our physiology, our genetics. They will take genetic material. This is very commonly reported. There are hundreds upon hundreds of reports of them collecting animals, farm animals, cows, rabbits, dogs, fish, digging soil samples, taking plant samples, leaves. So there's an agenda clearly of scientific study. And we do see, like I mentioned earlier, preponderance of sightings over anything having to do with technology. So we have lots of sightings over Air Force bases, over military bases, over airports, dams, power stations, nuclear, anything nuclear. And I would underline that.
Mhm.
Anything with nuclear is absolutely has a history of sightings to it. So they seem to be very much interested in our technological development. That is absolutely an agenda. There seems to be an agenda of showing themselves in a public way, because this is largely an evasive phenomena. You can't just go outside and see a UFO.
Right.
But on the other hand, there are these really dramatic in-your-face displays where they're clearly wanting to be seen. And I would point to the Hudson Valley wave, or a wave in France in 1954, or Wytheville, Virginia in the mid-1980s, or Gulf Freeze, or places all over the world where they come down and will show themselves to people in a very in-your-face, brazen, want-to-be-seen way. We call this a display. So there is an agenda of a publicity campaign on some level. There's various agendas. By and large, I don't think this is a nefarious phenomena.
Mhm.
I came into this field thinking there was, because we're a very fear-based society. Fear is what drives a lot of people's thinking, honestly,
Mhm.
and their behavior is very much fear-based. And the media absolutely adores a fear-based, lurid, scary story. And there is disinformation in this field. There are absolute flat-out liars, paid government agents. We know this. They've come out. When I say no, people have admitted this, I should say. So it's pretty clear that there's disinformation in this field. But by and large, it's taken me a long time to come to this conclusion. I don't think this is nefarious. It can be very, very traumatic for people to have an onboard encounter, to have your clothes removed and be physically examined, and you're restrained. And these people do not look human. This is very traumatic for people. And it can, when someone's in extreme terror, it's really a go-to to say, this is not good for me. I do not like
Mhm.
this. This is evil. But people who have repeated encounters at some point turn around and realize, like, this is not so bad. They healed me. The scariest thing I hear is the physical examination. I have virtually no cases of what I would call sadistic behavior or torture or ETs intentionally trying to hurt people. And I will say, when someone's kidnapped by other humans on Earth, it rarely ends well.
Mhm.
It just doesn't. And when someone is, taken by ETs, they're almost always returned, as near as we can tell. And
Are there any cases where they aren't returned?
yes, there absolutely are.
Really?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's not a lot of them,
What's
but
your theory? Yeah, definitely not common, but well, I shouldn't say that. I don't. I have no way of knowing that. But
yeah, well, neither do I. There's a lot of missing people, but there are
what do you
cases.
think? What do you think that is? Like, what are your theories on what that would be, or the reason for that?
I think some of it is voluntary. Honestly, I have a few cases like that. There was a gentleman I interviewed who was with a group of his friends, and one of them took a walk one evening. I just did an episode of this on my UFO channel.
This is the 12-foot tall, like the 12-foot tall
No,
entities. Oh, this is a different one.
this is a different one where one of the guys, Paul, decided to take a late night walk out from this cabin in Palm Springs, and where his group of friends was spending the weekend. And he comes back with this incredible story that he had come upon a landed UFO and there were aliens and they were very nice, largely human looking, but bald with large dark eyes and pale skin, and invited him to go with them, live with them permanently. And he said, no, I'm not doing that. And they said, well, we're coming back next year if you change your mind. And long story short, that's exactly what happened. And he drove off.
It just disappeared.
Yep, they found his car with the keys in it. It was a missing persons case. The police came, they interviewed everyone involved, his family and his friends, and who was one of the guys I interviewed, one of his friends. And they don't know where Paul is to this day. That's his real name. I do know his last name. It's very hard to say for sure what happened, but yeah, there's the case of Frederick Valentic in Australia, a young pilot who said, there's a UFO over my head. It's not a plane. I don't know what this is. He was in touch with the control tower operator. And then he cut out. And they never saw him again. And
Did they find his aircraft?
Nope. There were people who saw UFOs in the area. I mean, there's the case of Felix Moncla Jr. and his co-pilot, I forget his name, over Lake Superior. And the Air Force sent him to Vector with a UFO. And on radar, they watched his plane merge with the UFO, which darts off. He's gone, 22 years old, Felix Moncla Jr. So yeah, some people are taken permanently. That does happen. But generally, no, people are returned. And I can tell you what happens to a person when they're taken on board follows a very set pattern. They're physically examined. And if you do not have a strong fear response, you're not going to be paralyzed. You're not going to have amnesia problems. And they will give you a tour of the craft. This is not unusual. They will show you the engine room. They're like, this is how we do it. Here's how we fly our craft. It's usually along the lines of electromagnetism and riding gravitational waves and this sort of thing. Then they will take you to the observation deck, so to speak, and they will show you a star field or the moon. I have, several cases of people who said they took them to Saturn. I know how that sounds, but they're not just me saying this. Barbara Lamb, John Mack, Bud Hopkins, all the researchers have cases like these. And the number one message beyond don't be afraid, we won't hurt you, is warnings. Over and over and over again, it's the same message. They tell people, you are messing around with nuclear weapons. You are in a very dangerous position of destroying your world. You should not be doing this. Why are you polluting? Your warlike ways, your greed, your corruption is retarding your spiritual progress. This is the number one message, hands down. It was, as I said, Thomas Bullard who first got that. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting. This is what Barbara Lamb is getting, and John Mack, and all of them. Edith Fiore. I mean, there's a lot of researchers who have looked into this with, scientific backgrounds more than me. So that's very common. Another thing that's very common is being taken to the control room, sat down in the chair, like, would you like to fly our craft? Which is often with mental rapport, or sometimes more along the lines of a joystick. And often people are given very deep spiritual information and sort of elevated psychically. So people will come away from their experiences, as a general rule, having a profound variety of psychic and paranormal phenomena. They will start having precognition, going out of body, believe they can do Reiki or hands-on healing, start channeling, giving psychic readings, doing mediumship, past life recall, anything along these lines, dowsing even. I had an electronics engineer in the Navy leave that all behind and do dowsing very successfully, winning awards. So this is what's happening to people who are taken on board. And this is why I'm like, well, this isn't nefarious at all. They are not meaning to hurt people. Their agenda is to wake people up psychically, to try to move us off of fossil fuels, to prevent us from destroying our own planet. And the reason I say this is because I looked into who's being contacted. Why this person, not this person?
Yeah.
It's even, it really puzzled me because I couldn't see any patterns.
Did you find any patterns ultimately?
I did. I found 3 main patterns, 3 or 4, because it's evenly divided between men and women. There was a lot of talk about blood type, Rh negative. I'm like, no. It does turn up with a higher percentage, but doesn't explain it. It's not race, religion, politics. I mean, somewhat a location. If you live in a spot that's very heavy duty hotspot, your chances of being taken on board are slightly higher. It's not age. It happens to elderly people, very young kids. The main pattern is genetic lines. If your parents have had this experience, if your grandparents, chances are it's going to come at you as well and your children. This does seem to be generational. This is fairly well established.
Is it always that way, or is that it's just more common that way?
50-60% of the cases fit that pattern. But then there are one-offs. And that was really puzzling to me. Because you do see a lot of people driving along a desert road late at night. And I call that easy pickings. I think that's basically the pattern there. But another pattern I found, which was really shocking to me actually, was your profession, what you do for a living. Because you ask all questions, you're looking for patterns. And I didn't really ask that question a lot because it didn't seem relevant. But people kept telling me, and I kept running to doctors who were having these experiences, and teachers and social workers. I interviewed like 4 social workers in a row. It was shocking to me. I'm like, oh my God, here's another social worker. That's odd. And it started to ask that question, like, what do you do for a living? I'm a bus driver, one guy told me, but my real passion is this website I run, which is a spiritual website where he gives psychic readings and this sort of thing. And one lady I interviewed from Norway, she was healed by the ETs of back pain, described the same medical instrument. It was a one-off, no history of it in her family. She's never experienced anything like this. She's like, please don't use my name, but I really wanted to contact you because I heard about your research. And I said, okay, what do you do for a living? She says, well, I'm a retired artist, a graphics artist, but I really don't want you to use my name because I'm very famous in my country, in my community, for doing animal rights activism and human rights. And that's when alarm bells started going off in my head. I'm like, oh gosh, this is exactly what Michael Carter said, who fights against racism and was commended by President Clinton for his work on this, or John Hunter Gray, a Native American who spent his whole life doing social work. So we're seeing a lot of doctors, a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of, teachers, writers, inventors. Yeah, one guy flat out, the ETs told him, we are interested in your work with electronics. This is why we're contacting you. So it's people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity that are ones who are being contacted. It's a loose pattern, but it turns up. And finally, I would say people who have a psychic awareness, who have a history of perhaps a near-death experience or precognition, or sometimes that comes first, sometimes the experience sort of seems to spark that. But that turns up enough where, as a general rule, people who are reporting having repeated onboard encounters have a wide variety of paranormal phenomena surrounding them. So yeah, there are patterns.
All right. I think this is a good point to end this episode. Before that, though, folks who are listening in, if you have, what are your theories about, what these entities are? Are they, extraterrestrial based on the extremely strong evidence that Preston has presented, or, are they something else? Just, put something in the comments that what your theories are. And then also if you've had any experiences, if you could, please mention those in the comments. With that, thank you, Preston. This has been amazing as always. I'd like to do one more on kind of you alluded to kind of what the U.S. government may or may not know. I want to talk about that in the next episode if you're willing. So thank you very much, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Sean. It's an honor and a pleasure. I appreciate it.